All right, well, welcome everyone to a PSL demo day. Today, we're excited to have Parker Sheppard of the Heritage Foundation with us, and he's going to share some specifics about their macroeconomic model. Parker, welcome.
Hey, Jason, thanks for having me. Let me share the appropriate window and we'll get started. All right. Yeah, so thanks very much to PSL for hosting me. I hope this is an interesting and informative discussion about the work we've been doing at Heritage to try to account for policy's effects on macroeconomy. So I want to start off by just kind of taking the 40,000-foot view and saying what it is that we do at Heritage. We are here to formulate and promote public policies, but the policies that we come up with and advocate for are things that we want to be informed by research and things that we want to look at what's being written and published in the academic literature and take that and make it available for policymakers so that uh, there's actual heft and credibility behind the recommendations that we're making. The main audiences that we really want to reach in producing both this macro model and our other um, tax calculator model that is a complement to it. We're primarily interested in reaching members of Congress, additional policymakers in Washington, so that they can take our recommendations and actually put them into practice. And we also want to talk to academic and policy communities, like everyone on this call, who are also thinking seriously about policy that are trying to make sure that uh, potential ideas are getting evaluated and implemented in a good, rigorous way. So if you stick with me for the purpose of the presentation, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we're trying to accomplish with the macro model. I'll run through kind of a high level description of what is included and what is not. And then I'll walk through a brief example that is part of a recent paper that I published and discuss some of the things that we're working on for the future. This is a project that is in development. I still think that we are relatively early in the project. Um, so I'd like to tell you where we think it's going and see what your ideas are as to what would make it most useful. So there are a number of different fancy names that go out for all these models in this public policy space. I've decided to, for lack of a better name, to call this our federal budget growth model, because this is effectively, at its core, it's a neoclassical growth model where we've added a couple additional details to try to capture what we think are the most relevant aspects of policy. And our primary interest is in what's happening to macroeconomic aggregates, and in particular, how all of those feedback and affect the federal budget. So that includes all kinds of fiscal policy, but in particular, we're often interested in changing tax policy. And
Parker,
I'd say
quick
that,
question. This is
yeah,
Rick Evans. How
hey,
similar is this to the JCT Meg model?
um, I would say that the MEG model has a lot more detail. This is still relatively high level. Um, and that we're trying to abstract away from a lot of things and talk about what's happening um, at an aggregate level. But I think the big difference is in the size of the staff and the time in development to be able to break that down into different details.
Okay.
But that's what we're looking at. So both CBO and JCT have growth models that they use when they are scoring budgets, and they also use overlapping generations models, which are used by a number of different other policy outlets. Particularly, I know Rick and Jason, y'all have OG Core, OG USA, as well as the Penn Wharton budget model has an overlapping generations model that they've used to release some estimates that have featured prominently in the public debate. So those have slightly different features, where they're talking about household heterogeneity. This is not so much including that, where we're trying to talk about what's happening in the aggregate and then what's happening over time. And I think our big competitive focus here is on trying to pay careful attention to this dual distinction of ways to account for what's happening in the economy. So there are two different sets of accounting measures. One that's used within the national income and product accounts, where the NIPA's primary purpose is to describe what's happening in the economy, to describe how firms and households are producing goods and services and then being directed to their best use. So the primary things that the NIPAs talk about when they're describing the federal budget is breaking things down in terms of what's being used for consumption and investment, and transfer. So consumption and investment is involved in production, whereas a transfer, there is no production involved. The government is raising revenue and then transferring it without any condition of something new being produced. And that's a completely different structure from what's coming in and out of the Treasury. That's the primary purpose of budgetary accounting. Congress needs to know much more about cash flow than it does about production when it's thinking about or doing its green eye shades and saying, what are the revenues, what are the expenditures? And there often when you see the budgetary discussions, they're broken down on the expenditure side between mandatory spending, which is done automatically, or has been authorized previously, I should say, and discretionary spending, which is reauthorized each and every year. The differences there are basically down to certain concepts, netting and grossing, as well as timing, basically whether the timing is when something is produced or when something is actually paid. I think the best example there is the federal retirement funds are considered by BEA to be compensation for employees, so that they are in the hands of they're owned by the employees as production occurs, but because the cash is managed within the federal government and nothing ever leaves the Treasury, they're not recorded as an outlay in budgetary accounting until they're actually paid out. So that's the big difference, and that we think that both concepts are relevant for the debate. Often you see Congress discussing approval by mandatory and discretionary program because they're setting the budget and they want to record things based on the cash flow, but the government isn't necessarily trying to maximize the revenues less expenditures. It's setting policy based on all of these effects that the government has on the economy. So it needs to consider how tax rates and spending affect the economy, but then also how that feeds back into accounting for changes in revenues and based on a growing or shrinking economy. So both concepts are relevant. There are three main types of agents in the model. There's households, there are firms, there are broken into two types based on legal structure. One is subject to the corporate tax, one is not, and we just leave it that way. As well as there being two different governments. So there's a federal government, but then there's also a state and local composite government, and that structure also generally matches what's recorded in the NIPAs. There are effectively three different markets. So there's a market for labor, a market for savings and investment, and a market for the output of a final good.
Parker, are you doing differences in federal tax structure and state and local tax structure?
So the model could be set up so that state and local policy would be set separately from federal policy. So if we wanted to change state policy, we could, but it's only in the aggregate. So if we want to change taxes in Virginia, um, there's no government of Virginia within the model. Virginia would be represented within the total sum of state governments and of local governments. Does that
Okay,
answer your
and
question?
therefore plus federal. So you're just doing state plus federal plus local as some general tax function. Is that right?
So yeah, there is a state and local government um, it's a composite. So within the model, there are two governments, and then all of the policy parameters and production parameters are calibrated to roughly match its table 3.3 in the NIPAs that reports total values for state and local government. And there the difference is that if our primary audience is setting federal policy, but we don't want to look at the total a unified government for the entire country. We want to be mindful of the fact that the federal government is distinct from other levels of government across the country.
Okay, got it.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Thanks.
Okay. So there is growth over time in population, in labor productivity, and in prices. When we actually solve for everything, we stationarize around exogenous growth. Prices grow over time, so we report things in terms of nominal dollars, but the actual equations of the model are all written out in terms of real prices that are stationarized around this exogenous balanced growth path. And other than that, there's no money, there's no liquidity considerations, there's no central bank that's trying to adjust interest rate policy. We assume perfect information on behalf of the participants. So once policy is set, they know everything that's going to happen in the future. But we don't let the agents take that literally. So they still behave as if there's some kind of uncertainty, and really that only matters for risk premia. So there is a difference in rates of return on, say, federal debt and state and local debt, but that's really just accounted for. There's a parameter for different risk. There's an additional return on equity in firms, but that is there's basically one interest rate, and there's a difference between those returns that's calibrated based on the risk premium. And there's a closed economy. So for right now, there's no trade with outside countries. Everything is done. Output is C plus I plus G. So we have a representative household that has a certain amount of labor to sell and income from previous savings, and it's basically making decisions about how much to consume today, how much to go work, and how much to save in assets. And it can hold as assets government debt or value of firms. And again, because there's no risk or uncertainty, effectively equity and debt are the same thing. Solving out the household's optimization problem gives you a household labor supply function, saving supplies function, and their demand for final goods. Firms have a problem that they are trying to maximize the value of their firm, which is ultimately owned by the households. So they make choices about how much labor to hire. Firms own the capital, so they are deciding how much to invest to increase the capital stock that they own. And then they're deciding how much of the labor and capital to use in order to produce a final good. Now, the quirks that are available for these firms is that we assume, again, that there are certain firms that are subject to the corporate tax and certain firms that are not. So firms that are subject to the corporate tax pay corporate tax on their earnings. All types of firms have dividends that are there's just a fixed share of the after-tax earnings. And then they look at the cash flow so that once they make their decision about how much they want to invest, they pay their dividends, and they anything that they aren't able to finance out of retained earnings, they will then issue new equity and go that would be available in the market for households to be able to purchase. And the other big wrinkle that we incorporate into the model is a capital adjustment cost. So there, the basic framework is that you can't just add capital to the model costlessly. You have to take it offline for a little bit. So there is some foregone output associated with increasing the capital stock, and that is just in there to slow the rate at which the changes in tax policy and the after-tax return to capital show up in terms of the speed of investment and the growth in the capital stock. So within the firms, the solution to their optimization problem produces a function for labor demand, for savings demand, to be used for investment, and then how much of the final good that firms produce. The tax bases in the model, again, largely try to match taxes as recorded within the NIPAs. So there are income taxes that are paid subject to households' wages and salaries, income derived from capital gains, changes in the value of the firm that is owned by households, as well as interest income. Their households are also subject to payroll taxes. In the NIPAs, there payments for government social benefits, as well as the corporate income tax, and then taxes on production, which is a net combination of like sales taxes and subsidies. And policy here is measured by two different types of tax rates. So there are marginal taxes that show up in all the first order conditions for households and firms that that actually represent changes faced by an aggregate decision maker on the margin. And then there are average tax rates that try to match the tax bases recorded in the model to tax revenues that are measured in the NIPAs. And there, the idea is that if tax bases are growing, then for a given average tax rate, that should indicate that there's more tax revenue.
How do you get your marginal tax rates? I think I could see how you could do the average tax rates from the NIPA accounts. How would you get those marginal tax rate schedules?
So we take it as a weighted average of marginal taxes from the tax schedule. I think in the most recent paper that I put out, I took it from tax brackets, had IRS data, and just weighted it myself. In an older paper, we had run it through our individual income tax model. So again, you could we have more detail there that basically that individual income tax model effectively reproduces filing the 1040. So it's again, it's kind of a fuzzy concept because to what extent is there a representative person? You have different marginal rates faced by different people across the income distribution, across this nonlinear function of income tax rates. So I try not to get too hung up on the exact interpretation of the details, and say, for a given set of brackets under income taxes, this is the approximate weighted average marginal tax rate. And then if you have two different sets of brackets, compare the difference in that weighted average marginal tax rate and say, that's the difference in the policy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So the government spends it, and this is a big distinction that I like to make, that not every outlay is something that is part of G within C plus I plus G. So the government is spending for a certain proportion on consumption and investment, as well as transfers to households. So with the representative agent, transfers don't really have much meaning. The government is basically raising revenue from an undifferentiated mass of individuals and then transferring it back to them. But that's really, at least within the purposes of the model as it stands right now, just a way for accounting for the difference in tax revenue received and expenditures on the final good and total outlays. So there's a certain amount that the government is spending on outlays above and beyond what is necessary to fund its purchases of the final good. So there's,
I have a quick question here. And maybe this is like a bomb throwing question or something not productive. It's certainly not intended to be that way, but I'm just trying to think through the purpose of the model and whether it's best served by essentially kind of trying to force everything to go through a completely kind of closed growth model. So for example, if the goal is to assess the impact of tax policy or spending, if we want to take into account all the various equilibrium responses of interest rates and all that kind of stuff, then yeah, it's I think natural to go to kind of some kind of neoclassical model and think through putting all those pieces together. But the challenge of doing that is when we're forced to do a representative agent and kind of standard labor supply, all that kind of stuff, we then, I think, miss the mark in terms of what the data shows in terms of how consumption would respond to various sorts of policies or even labor supply, some of the micro heterogeneity stuff. So I almost wonder if the purpose is to analyze spending and tax policy changes, would we be better served by either as a first pass constructing a more micro-founded heterogeneous model where you're not having to solve for the interest rate. You're almost taking the interest rate as given, but being more granular in terms of consumption and labor supply behavior. And then either ignoring the interest rate response or else somehow taking, or somehow trying to shoehorn that into something. Anyway, I'm just trying to think through what is the purpose of this, and is it appropriate to invest so much in closing the whole model up, but then abstracting from this micro stuff where the data, in a way that will kind of cause us to move away from the data, or would it be better to invest more in that side, but maybe not have the equilibrium response of interest rates maybe be the top of mind? I don't know if that is clear at all. And again, I'm not meant to blow the whole thing up. It's just posing that question.
No. I don't think that's blowing the presentation up. I think it's a fair concern. I don't see a conflict, or at least like I see both approaches as complementary. And again, we are considering having we're working on a more micro-founded model that does leave these aggregate considerations unchanged. And we want to be able to get to a situation where the macro model is abstracting away from certain details about differences across individual households, and is trying to primarily tell a story about growing or shrinking the size of the pie. Because again, the big argument that I think is relevant for discussion, particularly when issues about dynamic scoring show up, is that if you a lot of the arguments specifically behind advocating for smaller taxes are that you're doing it to increase economic growth. That's the entire purpose. So you're not giving an accurate representation of what's going on if you assume that there is no corresponding increase in investment that is going to exist to grow the economy. So you have to capture that how policy is affecting interest rates and how it's enticing that additional investment in order to tell that story.
Right. So I mean, to that point, I mean, I completely agree about the growth being a key thing, and this is something I think our the market-oriented folks and our I hate to call sides, whatever. I think that, well, number one is that's an inherent problem whenever we look at a model that doesn't have endogenous growth, right? I mean, we're always going to be looking at a situation where there's some policy change, and best case scenario, there's a kind of a transition path to a new steady state, but then effectively the growth rate still doesn't change in the long run. So I think that's like one big thing to think about. But even ignoring that issue, like when I think about tax policy changes and I think about the representative agent, I mean, we're talking if you go to the literature, how elastic is labor supply with respect to a tax rate change? When you look at this kind of representative household, it's usually not that much. So you think, oh, okay, there's really that much going on. But on the one hand, on the other hand, I actually think that if you look at some of the more recent research, where you find that if you change tax policy, you have second earners jumping into the market who maybe wouldn't otherwise. And you actually might get bigger labor supply responses when you explicitly distinguish between that extensive margin and 200 versus 100 households versus just one representative household kind of substituting away from leisure. So again, I think we could actually get bigger responses in some sense if we think through some of the micro response of labor and consumption relative to the kind of rep agent frictionless models.
Right. Again, that's why I see all these things as complementary. I would love to have a more micro-founded model where we can talk about number of people within a household and be able to capture what's happening at that at the extensive margin, because I don't think that there is a huge elasticity for the intensive margin. It's primarily if you have these changes in policy, what's happening to bring in second earners at the extensive margin that would give you a more significant change. Even then, the model as we have it calibrated has a relatively inelastic labor supply in the aggregate, because we're only talking about hours. We're not talking about, or at least within the model, we're not able to break it down into individual job holders within households. It's just the aggregate number of hours worked across a representative household. But yeah, those are things that I think it's really useful to have both stories being told and have them working together. And I mean, one of the things I want to hit on in this presentation is that trying to answer all these things all at once is actually something that is difficult in order to be able to, you have these goals of things you want to talk about, but then there's also the tractability of being able to write it down into a model and be able to solve it and produce a result. So this is, I mean, the presentation is kind of where we are in terms of development. This is something that we're trying to build up and add these additional details layer by layer. But I think it really would help to have multiple different models that could talk to each other to be able to tell that story. That's exactly what you see coming from CBO, JCT as well, that there's no one model to cover everything. You have certain models that that emphasize certain aspects and de-emphasize aspects, and that's a policy choice that every modeler is facing, and one that is what drives a useful policy conversation. So let me keep going, and I'll try to punt some of the other questions to the end.
I think that'd be great. Yeah, Aaron, good questions. Yeah. Parker, excellent answers. But yeah, we'd love to see what else you're showing, because you're going to talk about future directions, as well as show an example, I believe. So that will give us more ammunition for questions later on. Thanks, Parker.
So the government also contributes to producing things, and that's really just it's a calibrated constant based off of what the government is spending. And so we solve for equilibrium. Basically, there's equilibrium wage that clears the labor markets, interest rates on the financial markets, and good old Y equals C plus I plus G, saying that output equals final demand. So to solve the model, you need to specify a path of policy for federal and state and local taxes and spending. And so you need to do that from the initial period all the way to the end of your simulation period. And in practice, that breaks down into covering the 10-year budget window, because that's what is most discussed within the budget negotiations. And then eventually there's some steady state policy. So to get between the 10-year policy and the steady state policy, there's some period of convergence. Often there's basically, I set it by an AR1 process to say that policy adjusts slowly back towards whatever the steady state is. But if policy is roughly or progressing in the future in a way that does not allow the federal government to balance its budget over the long run, I wait to have some kind of closure rule and say, like right now it's at 30 years, to say that the budget continues on roughly as is until about 30 years, in which case then there is an adjustment to transfers that begins to balance the budget, and the amount of debt outstanding gets ratcheted down closer and closer to the long run every year. So with a path for policy, a steady state, and an initial state, then the solution is a path for capital and labor and the corresponding equilibrium conditions that give you a full set of transition paths between the initial state and the steady state. And what I think is really cool about this is that agents are able to look into the future and see the entire path of policy. So we can also model things where policy is set to last for a number of years, and then they change in the future. And this is often the case when things are set for reconciliation purposes to go through a 10-year budget window, and then they revert back to some other value. We can incorporate that effect for agents in the model. And again, to back to the story about the relevance of the macro model and what's actually happening, and what we're trying to say about the connection between taxes and economic growth and the size of the economy, is that there are two main stories here, where one is the extent to which corporate taxes and taxes on income and savings create a wedge that reduces the tax base. And so if you cut those taxes, do you see more investment, more labor, more income being generated that produces a bigger tax base? But also, if the government is going to reduce taxes, that reduces revenues if the government is operating on the right side of the Laffer curve, which is going to increase the deficit, which could potentially crowd out investment, and you'd see higher interest rates. So there's a tension there between those two mechanisms, and it's actually up to the model to say which one is going to net and win out as to which one is bigger. So for a recent application, we looked at a dynamic score for our own blueprint recommendations, which largely consist of extending the TCJA individual tax cuts, further reducing the corporate tax rate from 21 to 15%, consolidating brackets, and allowing for full and immediate expensing of new investment. There are a number of different other changes to spending, but all the big ones are meant to address entitlements, the biggest component of spending. So there are reforms to Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security that are all designed to cap the amount of spending that these programs face to try to get them back on solvent financial footing. So as a highlight, we found that there was an increase in GDP of 5 trillion over the 10-year window. And we were able to report economic effects over the 10-year window and in the long run. So there's also this, you can see the effect of the capital adjustment costs, where there's only a 2.7% increase in GDP within the 10-year window, and growth being the extent that's accounted for by capital, not just the exogenous growth, that continues to accrue after the 10-year budget window, up to a total change of 6.2%. And then this is also a big question that comes out of debates around the budget as to whether or not tax cuts are self-financing. Do you see enough revenue generated by growing the size of the pie that it pays for the loss as measured on a static basis? And at least in our estimate of, if the blueprint were enacted, calculate that the dynamic effects would increase revenue relative to the static amount, but only by about 23% of the static cut. And this here is the main output of what the model is. So I'm not going to run through each of the numbers in the table, but basically there is we report a baseline measure that is what the equilibrium in the model is on something that approximates the CBO baseline. Then we run the model using our alternative policies, but then the baseline tax bases, and use that to calculate effectively a static score. And then there's the full dynamic score from the alternative policy. So you can show those three, and basically the differences between those three there's a difference in static terms, and you can pull out the dynamic effects, and the sum of those two gives you the total effects. So from this table, again, the dynamic effects get you an increase in revenues, but a lot of the budgetary balancing here is still primarily being borne by cuts to spending, not counting on this additional dynamic effect for revenue. So this is kind of where we stand at this point in time. I feel like we are still early in this project, and want to continue to add details into the model. Things that are top of mind right now are fleshing out some of the behavior of firms within the model. So adding details to the capital structure. So relaxing that assumption that dividends are constant as a proportion of revenue. Allowing for debt and equity to have a meaningful capital structure for firms to choose, as well as adding detail about a stock of tax deductions, so that we can more appropriately model changes in the timing of expensing, and when firms are allowed to take depreciations for new investments. I think with seeing the increase in inflation, it's useful to model some of the way that the government's debt is outstanding and the timing of that. So there's just a single quarterly debt instrument available for the government right now. It would be nice to include some longer term debt as well. And then, as we mentioned before, including overlapping generations and differences in income across households. That difference in income will get you a better calculation for how these marginal tax rates differ in labor supply and saving supply across households. And then if we're talking about making reforms to entitlements, then it's really important that we be able to have not just a representative agent, but talk about how those different reforms may be targeted and affect different generations who are closer to retirement or needing to file for Medicare. And then, of course, adding an open economy, that some of that interest rate response to crowding out may be made up by access to international capital flows. Would love to be able to expand and incorporate some of the rest of the world into additional development. And of course, since this is a PSL demo day, and PSL is about having open source models, this is a closed source model, but I'm intrigued by the idea of potentially opening it up. I see a lot of benefits in putting everything out there so that we are fully transparent with how we're arriving at our results. We're allowing other policy experts to look at what we're doing, be able to reproduce our results, and as well as make what we're working on available for driving discussion. I think that these are very complicated issues that, and I think what we want to do is be able to, as economists, handle that complexity and reduce that complexity so that policymakers can talk about the values that they most want to represent in policy, and they don't have to get bogged down into the details of the economic mechanisms. Some of our residual concerns, though, are, of course, if you open it up and you make it freely available so that anybody can just take the model and then use it, to what extent is what do we have unique that's left for us? As well as the potential of saying, here's all these details. What if somebody takes it, misinterprets it, wants to make a big stink about it, and it just gets taken in the media in the wrong way? So that's something I would really appreciate thoughts from this group about, as to what you see is valuable coming out of this, and what you'd like to see open source, and how we should address those concerns about the benefits and the potential issues.
Parker, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. At this time, we'll kind of open up to questions, but let me take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first one. I really like the table of results you presented there with the static versus dynamic analysis. Now, can you delve a little bit into the methodology there? Were your static results from this model or another model? And if they were from the macro model, how do you compute the static effects from it?
So as you solve the model, it's going to give you the full dynamic solution that is the optimal behavior for each policy. And the baseline there is not what comes out of the CBO. It is the model calibrated to reproduce something that is very equivalent to the CBO baseline. So this is when you're comparing the results in that table, it's an apples to apples comparison in terms of outputs from the model. I'm not comparing what our model is producing to the actual published estimate from the CBO. So there's a baseline set of tax bases that comes out of the optimal solution. There is an alternative set that comes out, and the static estimate is the alternative marginal and average tax rates applied to the baseline tax bases.
Got it. Makes sense. All right. I think we're doing something similar with OG Core and interpreting those dynamic or static results, but just want to make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah. It's again, I don't want to try to add a lot of fanciness to the interpretation, because there isn't a lot. It's still representative agent. There's not a lot of detail to talk about. What we're really saying is, if this policy is in place, what can you expect for the aggregate tax base? Is the tax base going to grow, or is it going to shrink? To really capture, because when you simplify the story about dynamic scoring down, it is that by shrinking the tax wedge, you get a bigger level of the economy. a bigger set of tax bases from which to draw revenue. And so really that's the primary story that's being captured out of the model.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Parker. Other questions?
Hey, Parker, thanks for this. I kind of joined a couple minutes late, but this looks real interesting. I like your approach to keeping it simple. Always like simple models, seldom see them, but they're a rare beast. But we've got our own model of tax foundation, of course, that has been for more than a decade anyway. So a lot of detail in it, but it's got some simple, agreeable concepts at its core, of course. So did I miss the timeline of development here, and sort of what is your expected stages of development, and how long will this take to add for instance, the detail on the individual side and open economy and all
that? It's one of those things where it's like if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be research. That I've found a lot of what has added time into the production of this model is trying to calibrate the values to make sure that what is being returned by the model is something that's sensible. So I don't know that I want to put an end date on when development will be done, or what final product will be available. This is I think much more of a process than an end goal, and I'm trying to put these results out there as we're developing the model, that if you kind of wait around for everything to be absolutely perfect, I have lots of perfectionist tendencies. I don't want to show any of my work until it's up to my high standards. But if we did that, we could wait years. So this is just kind of going to be, as things become available, we will add them and incorporate them and try to release them and update the model as manpower allows for us to be able to add. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I guess I guess I have we of course don't do spending, so I guess I'm wondering, what is your approach on the spending side? You did talk about the OLG model as a way to get at the entitlements in particular. Is that can you where are you at in that process, and what are you thinking in terms of thinking of incorporating an OLG model, or sort of picking one off the shelf, or sort of developing that in-house? Or
no, it would be developed in-house. I have a couple examples, a couple papers that I think would be interesting. Again, OG Core, OG USA is an interesting example that I think we'll look at. We'll take elements from what's out there and try to pick and choose the elements that reflect the story that we want to tell, that we think is most useful for policy, and then again for entitlement reform, that this is something that is going to be exceedingly relevant for Congresses coming up in the next decade, that they need to start thinking about how to reform these systems to make them get them on a sustainable basis. And that means figuring out exactly some adjustment to revenues and spending, and to be able to say exactly who is going to benefit from those changes, who is going to be harmed by those changes, and talk at a more detailed level than just can be captured by a representative agent model to be able to say, to account for welfare that is adjusted by the timing of changes in eligibility and payouts. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on as we start building up something with overlapping generations. If there is, say, a plan that would allow younger generations to opt out. So someone who's older may still continue to participate in the system. Someone who's younger may decide if they want to continue to participate in the system, that's a choice up to them. If they want to opt out and be able to take that money and invest it in the market and see if they can get a better return, have that option available. That's something that you need to be able to break that down by generation. That's what we're going to look at in terms of developing an OLG model.
Got it.
And happy to talk more. Again, part of the reason for coming to this and kind of showing where we are and talking about this is that we want to be a participant in policy conversations with other researchers. All of y'all are working on these issues. So outside of a presentation, I'm again happy to talk more if you have other things to be a resource and help with some. If there's something out of this that you find useful, you want to incorporate into what y'all are doing at Tax Foundation, happy to help.
Great, appreciate it.
Well, Parker, with that, thank you so much. Yeah, this really sparked a lot of conversation today, and I think the dialogue will continue. So thank you for sharing your work today.
All right, appreciate it. Thanks, Jason.
All right,
thanks
everybody.